Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain was coming down in sheets that October night when I first saw her. Marlena sat hunched on that bus stop bench like a broken bird, her thin frame shaking against the storm. What caught my attention wasn't just her obvious distress. It was the way she clutched that small leather purse against her chest, like it contained her very soul. I'd been driving home from my night shift at the factory when I spotted her. Something about the scene made me pull over. Maybe it was the way the streetlight caught the raw burns on her hands, or how she kept whispering to herself in the rain. "Ma'am, you okay?" I called out, stepping into the downpour. "Need a ride somewhere?" She looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. Her lip was split, purple bruises bloomed along her jawline, and her brown hair hung in wet tangles. But it was her expression that stopped me cold, a mixture of terror and strange, unsettling peace. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunder. What he became, what we all became. I moved closer, noting how she flinched at my approach. "What who became?" "Ma'am, you're hurt. Let me help you." She shook her head slowly, then held up her hands. The burns were fresh, angry red welts that wrapped around her palms and fingers like she'd grabbed something on fire. But strangest of all, the pattern of the burns seemed deliberate, almost sacred. "He burned my Bible," she said, staring at her damaged hands. Laughed while he did it. Made me watch every page turn to ash. Her voice cracked. "He thought that would break me. Break my faith." Another crash of thunder shook the night, and she smiled. Actually smiled, despite her injuries. "But he never expected what God would do in return," she whispered, and something in her tone made my blood run cold. "He thought he could mock the Almighty and walk away untouched. Thought his little rituals in the basement would protect him." "Rituals?" I asked, but she was already standing, swaying slightly on her feet. "I need to tell someone," she said, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Before they find me. Before they realize I know what really happened to him." She looked directly into my eyes. "Will you listen? Will you believe what sounds impossible?" I nodded, though something deep in my gut warned me I was about to hear something that would change everything I thought I knew about good, evil, and what happens when they collide. She glanced around nervously, then back at her burned hands. "His name was Garrett, and what he did to me, to my faith, to God's word, double quotes." She paused as lightning illuminated her battered face. "Let's just say the good. Lord has very particular ways of answering prayers for justice." The way she said it made me shiver despite the warm October air. Marlena wiped rain from her face and began speaking in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away, like she was watching her own memories unfold. "I was 19 when I met Garrett," she said, staring at the empty street ahead. "She's just a girl from nowhere, really. My daddy had lost the farm and Mama was sick with the cancer that would take her 6 months later. We had nothing, less than nothing if you count the debts." She shifted on the bench, wincing as her ribs protested the movement. Garrett seemed like salvation walking on two legs. He was 32, owned a big house on Maple Street, worked steady at the shipping docks, had money when nobody else did. When he asked Daddy for my hand, it wasn't really a question. I watched her face as she spoke, noting how her expression softened despite her injuries. Even now, remembering those early days brought something almost peaceful to her features. "The first few months were different," she continued. "He could be gentle when he wanted to be. Brought me flowers on Sundays, took me to nice restaurants downtown, made me feel special, you know, like I mattered." She laughed bitterly. "I was so grateful to have a roof over my head, food on the table. I thought I was blessed. When did things change?" I asked quietly. "They didn't change," she said, shaking her head. "That's what I learned too late. They just, revealed themselves. Garrett didn't become a monster. He always was one. He just got better at showing his true face once he knew I had nowhere else to go." She touched the bruises on her jaw absently. "The first sign was how he talked about God. I'd been raised in church, you understand. Not perfect, but faithful. When I'd mention wanting to find a congregation in town, he'd get this look in his eyes. Cold, like I'd said something dirty. 'God doesn't live here,' he told me once, standing in our kitchen. 'Haven't you figured that out yet, girl?' The way he said it, like he knew something I didn't, like it wasn't just his opinion, but fact. Thunder rolled overhead again, and Marlena pulled her thin jacket tighter. I should have paid attention to the basement door. He kept it locked, always. Said it was just storage, nothing for me to worry about. But sometimes late at night, I'd hear sounds down there, voices, and smells that didn't belong in any decent home." She looked at me directly. "You have to understand, I wanted to believe in the good parts. The gentle touches, the fancy dinners, the way he'd sometimes hold me like I was precious. I told myself the strange things were just quirks. Every marriage has adjustments, right? But the house itself felt wrong. Even on sunny days it stayed cold. Shadows in places where there shouldn't be shadows, and the way animals acted around it, double quotes, she shuddered. Dogs would cross the street rather than walk past our yard. Cats would hiss at empty corners. How long before he showed his true nature? 8 months, she said without hesitation. 8 months of playing house before I found that old Bible in the attic. That Bible changed everything, Marlena said, her voice growing distant. I was cleaning the attic. Garrett had finally given me permission to go up there when I found it tucked behind some old picture frames. Leather-bound pages yellowed with age, but the words still clear as day. She paused, touching the burns on her palms. It had belonged to the previous owner, a woman named Catherine Morrison. Her name was written inside the front cover in beautiful handwriting, along with a date, 1987. Same year she disappeared, according to the neighbors. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Disappeared. That's what Mrs. Henderson next door told me later, said Catherine. Just vanished one day. Left everything behind, clothes, jewelry, even her car. Police investigated, but double quotes, she shrugged. Small town. Things get buried. Marlena's eyes grew darker. I started reading that Bible every day, secretly while Garrett was at work. It brought me peace in ways I hadn't felt since Mama died. The words seemed to jump off the page like they were meant specifically for me, especially the Psalms about deliverance from evil. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. I should have been more careful, should have hidden it better, but I was naive, thought I could trust my own husband with my faith. He found it, came home early one Thursday, walked right into the bedroom where I was reading Psalm 91, He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High. I was speaking the words aloud when I heard his footsteps on the stairs. The memory seemed to physically pain her. The look on his face when he saw that Bible in my hands. I'd never seen anything like it, pure hatred. Not just anger, hatred so deep it seemed to change the very air in the room. Where did you get that? He asked, but his voice wasn't his anymore. Deeper, colder. I stuttered something about the attic, about cleaning, but he wasn't really listening. He was staring at the Bible like it had personally offended him. She pulled her jacket closer. That's when he said it. God doesn't live in this house, Marlena. He's not welcome here, and neither are his words. Then he grabbed the Bible from my hands and threw it against the wall so hard the binding cracked. I tried to pick it up, but he stepped on my hand. Not hard enough to break bones, but hard enough to leave marks. Touch it again, he said, and you'll learn what real pain feels like. Marlena looked at me with eyes full of remembered terror. That night he locked the Bible in his desk drawer. But more than that, he started watching me, constantly, questioning every move I made, every word I spoke. The house that had felt cold before became suffocating, and that's when the real changes began. He started coming home with that smell, like sulfur mixed with something rotten. Started talking in his sleep, but not in English. Words that made my skin crawl just hearing them. She shuddered. I realize now that finding that Bible wasn't an accident. Catherine Morrison left it there for whoever came next. A warning, a weapon. She knew what lived in that house, what Garrett really was, but I was too young, too scared, too dependent to understand. I thought I could outlast it, pray my way through it. I had no idea how deep the darkness in that house really went. I spent the next 3 months telling myself lies, Marlena said, her voice barely audible over the dying storm. You know how it is when you're trapped. Your mind starts playing tricks, making excuses for things that should terrify you. She shifted uncomfortably, favoring her left side. I told myself Garrett was just stressed from work. The shipping company was laying people off, and he was drinking more to cope. The strange smells, old plumbing, the weird noises from the basement, house settling, those awful words he muttered in his sleep. Just nonsense from too much whiskey. But deep down, you knew better. Deep down, I was screaming, she admitted. But I had nowhere to go. No money, no family left, no friends. Garrett made sure of that. He'd driven away anyone who might have helped me, isolated me completely. So I did what trapped people do. I adapted. She touched her throat gently. I started going to church in secret. Found a small congregation downtown called Mercy Baptist. Pastor Benjamin was this elderly man with kind eyes who never asked too many questions. When I showed up with bruises I couldn't quite explain away, I'd slip out when Garrett went to Murphy's Tavern on Wednesday evenings. Told him I was grocery shopping, but instead I'd sit in that little sanctuary and pray like my life depended on it, which I suppose it did. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter, but Marlena still seemed to be drowning in her memories. Pastor Benjamin gave me a small cross necklace. Nothing fancy, just silver-plated metal on a thin chain. But when I wore it under my clothes, I felt protected somehow, like I had a secret weapon Garrett couldn't see. How long did you manage to keep it secret? 2 months, she said grimly. I got careless. Started humming hymns while I cleaned house. Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art, songs from my childhood that brought comfort. I didn't realize I was doing it until Garrett came home early one afternoon and heard me. Her hand instinctively went to her neck, where I could see the faint outline of a chain mark. He grabbed me so fast I didn't see it coming, slammed me against the kitchen wall and demanded to know where I'd been learning that garbage. When I tried to deny it, he found the cross. She closed her eyes, reliving the moment. He ripped it right off my neck. The chain cut into my skin, left a mark that took weeks to heal. Then he held it up like it was something diseased. "I told you," he said, and his voice was so cold it made my teeth chatter. "God is not welcome in this house. Neither are his trinkets." Then he dropped the cross on the kitchen floor and stepped on it, ground it under his boot until it was nothing but twisted metal. That night he made me watch while he searched every inch of our bedroom. Found Catherine's Bible hidden in my pillowcase. I begged him not to take it, told him it was just for comfort, but he laughed. Not a human sound, something else entirely. "Comfort?" he said. "You want comfort? Let me show you what happens to people who bring God into my house." That's when he dragged me to the basement door for the first time. She opened her eyes and looked directly at me. I wasn't ready for what I saw down there. Nothing could have prepared me for the truth about what my husband really was, what that house really was. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. That's when I learned that some men don't just reject God, they actively serve his enemy. "The basement wasn't just a basement," Marlena whispered, her burned hands trembling as she spoke. "It was a shrine to things that should never be worshipped." She took a shaky breath. Garrett dragged me down those wooden steps, his grip so tight on my arm I knew there'd be bruises. The smell hit me first, that sulfur stench mixed with something else. Something that smelled like death. I leaned closer, dreading what came next, but unable to look away from her haunted expression. The walls were covered in symbols, not painted, carved deep into the wood with something sharp. They seemed to move in the candlelight, writhing like living things. And the altar, she shuddered violently. It was made from what looked like old church pews, but turned upside down, defiled with stains I didn't want to identify. There were photographs pinned to the walls, dozens of them, not family pictures, ritual pictures. Men in black robes standing around that altar, their faces hidden but their intentions clear. And in the center of every photo was Garrett, holding objects that made my stomach turn. She pressed her burned palms against her eyes. Bones, animal skulls arranged in patterns, candles made from, quote I don't know what, but they burned with flames that cast no warmth, and books. Ancient-looking books written in languages that hurt to look at. But the worst part wasn't what I saw, it was what I realized. This wasn't new. The basement had been used for these purposes for years, maybe decades. The wood was stained black in places, worn smooth from repeated use. Garrett hadn't created this temple of darkness. He'd inherited it. "Welcome to the real world, wife," he said, pushing me toward the altar. "This is what power looks like. This is how real men get what they want." He gestured to the photographs. "These are my brothers. We meet here every new moon, and we take what God refuses to give us." My throat felt dry. What kind of things? Money, influence, control over others. Her voice dropped. Revenge against anyone who crossed us. Protection from consequences. The kind of power that comes with a price paid in blood and souls. He showed me a ledger then, names and dates going back 20 years. People who had offended the group and what happened to them afterward. Car accidents, house fires, sudden illnesses, disappearances. She looked directly at me. Catherine Morrison's name was in that book, along with 3 other women who had lived in that house before me. All of them had been wives. All of them had been faithful. All of them had tried to bring God's light into that darkness. She touched her neck where the cross had been, and all of them had learned what happens when you challenge forces that have been feeding on that town for generations. Garrett made me kneel before that defiled altar, made me watch while he took Catherine's Bible and placed it among his ritual objects. "Your God," he said, "is about to serve mine, just like you are." That's when I understood. I hadn't just married an abusive man, I'd married a servant of evil, and that house, that basement, those rituals, they were all part of something bigger, something that had been growing in the shadows of our little town for decades. She stood up suddenly, pacing despite her obvious pain. But here's what Garrett didn't know, what none of them knew. She smiled grimly. God doesn't just watch his children suffer. Sometimes he prepares them for war. That night changed me, Marlena said, sinking back onto the bench. Not just because of what I'd seen, but because of what Garrett did afterward. He wanted to make sure I understood my place in his world. She pulled her sleeves down, but not before I caught sight of more scars along her wrists. He dragged me back upstairs and threw me onto our bed. Then he went to his desk and pulled out Catherine's Bible. My Bible. The one thing that had given me hope. "Time for a lesson," he said, and his voice wasn't just cruel anymore, it was excited, like he was enjoying himself. He made me sit on the floor and watch while he tore out pages, one by one, starting with Genesis. Her breathing became shallow. He didn't just rip them. He took his time, reading verses aloud in a mocking voice before destroying them. "In the beginning, God created ... single quotes rip. The Lord is my shepherd ... single quotes tear. For God so loved the world ... single quotes shred." I begged him to stop, offered to do anything, be anything he wanted. But that only made him laugh harder. You still don't get it," he said. "Your God isn't coming to save you. He can't even save his own words. She closed her eyes, lost in the nightmare. Then he did the unthinkable. He urinated on the remaining pages, right there in front of me. The word of God soaked in his filth while he laughed like a demon. I felt sick listening to her, but she wasn't finished. But that wasn't enough for him. He gathered all the torn and soiled pages into our metal wastebasket, got his lighter, the same one he used for his cigarettes, and set them on fire. Made me watch every page burn while he asked, "Where's your God now, Marlena?" Why isn't he stopping this? The flames turned strange colors as they consumed the pages, blues and greens that shouldn't exist in normal fire. And the smoke, it formed shapes that looked almost like faces, screaming faces. She opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. I wanted to die right then. The physical beatings were nothing compared to watching God's word burn while my husband mocked everything I believed. I felt empty, like my soul had been scooped out and replaced with ash. How did you survive it? I almost didn't, she admitted. For 3 weeks after that night, I was like a ghost in my own life. Garrett would come home drunk, use me however he wanted, and I just endured it. The basement meetings continued. Sometimes I could hear chanting through the floorboards, words that made the house itself seem to groan. He started bringing his brothers upstairs sometimes, 5 men who looked at me like I was livestock. They'd sit in my living room drinking my coffee, discussing their next project while I served them like a slave. But the worst part was the silence from heaven. I prayed and prayed, but it felt like my words just bounced off the ceiling, like God had turned his back on me because I'd failed to protect his word. She touched her burned hands again. I started to believe what Garrett said, that I was abandoned, that evil had won, that my faith had been nothing but delusion. What changed, Pastor Benjamin? She said softly. He came looking for me when I stopped showing up at church. Garrett was at work and I almost didn't answer the door, but something about his persistent knocking, I finally opened it. He took one look at me and said, "Child, you look like you've been wrestling with demons." I started crying then. Couldn't stop. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone. Her voice grew stronger. That's when I learned that sometimes God's answer to prayer isn't rescue, it's reinforcement. He was about to send me exactly what I needed for the battle ahead. Pastor Benjamin didn't ask questions that day, Marlena continued, her voice gaining strength. He just looked at me standing in that doorway, bruised, hollow-eyed, wearing the same dress for the 3rd day running, and said, "May I come in for some tea?" She managed a small smile at the memory. Such a simple request, but it felt revolutionary. No one had asked permission to enter that house in months. Garrett just took what he wanted, brought who he wanted. But Pastor Benjamin waited for my invitation. I was terrified Garrett would come home early, but something about the old man's presence made me brave. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Garrett had burned my Bible, and he poured kindness into that cursed space like sunlight through a window. He was probably 70, with white hair and hands that shook slightly when he lifted his teacup. But his eyes, they were sharp as glass and filled with a wisdom that seemed ancient. When he looked at me, I felt like he could see straight through to my soul. "I've been a pastor for 43 years, he said quietly. "Seen every kind of darkness this world has to offer. The kind that comes from broken hearts, broken minds, and ... single quotes." He paused, looking around my kitchen. "The kind that comes from broken spirits, deliberately feeding on evil." I watched Marlena's face as she remembered. The lines of tension seemed to ease slightly. He knew. Without me saying a word, he knew what kind of house I was living in, what kind of man I'd married. "The spiritual temperature in here," he said, "is colder than a tomb. But you're still here, child, still breathing, still fighting. That tells me God isn't finished with your story yet." "Did you tell him about the basement, the rituals?" I started to, but he held up his hand. "Some knowledge is dangerous to carry," he said, "but I'll tell you what I know. This house has a history. Dark things have happened here for generations, and you're not the first godly woman to find herself trapped within these walls." She leaned forward slightly. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something that made my heart stop. A small silver cross on a thin chain. Not just any cross, the exact same design as the one Garrett had destroyed. "This belonged to Catherine Morrison," he said, placing it gently on the table between us. "She came to me before she disappeared. Told me things that would curdle most people's blood. She also told me something else, that God was preparing a way of escape, even if she wouldn't live to see it." My hands were shaking as I reached for it. "She left this for whoever came after her," Pastor Benjamin continued. "Said the next woman would need it more than she did. Said it would be blessed for battle." The moment my fingers touched that cross, everything changed. Warmth spread up my arms like electricity, but gentle electricity. For the first time in weeks, I felt God's presence again. Not distant, not silent, right there in my kitchen. Stronger than all the darkness Garrett had brought into that house. Pastor Benjamin smiled. "She's been praying for you, you know, from wherever faithful souls go when they leave this earth. Praying that you'd be strong enough to finish what she started." "What did she start?" I asked. "War," he said simply. "Against powers and principalities that have been feeding on this town for too long. Catherine planted seeds before she died. You're going to help them grow. He stood to leave but paused at the door. "Wear the cross close to your heart," he said. "And remember, sometimes God's greatest victories look like defeats at first. Sometimes he has to let evil think it's winning before he shows his true power." Marlena touched her neck where the chain would have rested. I hid that cross under my clothes and wore it every day. And for the first time since finding that Bible, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. The cross gave me courage I didn't know I possessed. Marlena said, unconsciously touching her collarbone where it had hung. For 2 weeks I felt protected. The darkness in the house seemed held back somehow. Garrett was still cruel, still violent, but it was like there was a barrier around my spirit he couldn't quite penetrate. She paused, watching a police car cruise slowly past the bus stop. But courage can be dangerous when you're dealing with evil that's been established for decades. It made me bold, maybe too bold. I started exploring. When Garrett was at work, I'd search the house systematically, looking for answers about Catherine, about the other women whose names were in that ledger. I found things hidden in places you'd never think to look. Like what? Letters, she said quietly. Stuffed inside old pillowcases, taped under drawer bottoms, even rolled up inside the curtain rods. All from Catherine, all addressed to whoever would come after her. She'd known she was going to die, and she'd spent her final months preparing ammunition for the next battle. Marlena's burned hands clenched into fists. But it was what I found in Garrett's personal belongings that changed everything. He kept a locked box under our bed, thought I didn't know about it. But Catherine's letters had mentioned where men like him hide their most precious secrets. I picked the lock with a hairpin while he was passed out drunk one Saturday afternoon. Inside were photographs that made the basement pictures look like vacation snapshots. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Quote, "They weren't just doing rituals down there. They were documenting murders, real murders. Men, women, children, who had crossed them over the years. And Garrett. He wasn't just a member of this group, he was the one who performed the killings." I felt my blood turn to ice. "How could you tell?" The photographs were arranged chronologically. 23 years of death, starting when Garrett was barely 18. But in every single picture, he was the one holding the knife, the one making the cuts, the one she couldn't finish. And there were trophies, jewelry taken from victims, locks of hair, things that proved these weren't just sick fantasies, they were records of actual crimes. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. But the worst discovery was at the bottom of the box. A marriage certificate, not ours, his first one, to Catherine Morrison, dated 1987, 6 months before her disappearance. Catherine hadn't just lived in that house. She'd been his wife, and when she started bringing God's light into his darkness, when she started disrupting his carefully constructed evil, she didn't need to finish. The papers underneath told the whole story. Insurance documents showing Catherine as beneficiary of a large policy. Bank records showing money transferred after her death. Property deeds showing how Garrett inherited everything when she disappeared. He hadn't just killed her. He'd planned it. Married her specifically to kill her, to use her faith as some kind of perverted sacrifice to whatever demons he served. Marlena looked directly at me, and I realized I wasn't his second wife. According to those documents, I was his fourth. 2 other women between Catherine and me, both young, both faithful, both now buried somewhere only he knew. I was never meant to be a wife. I was meant to be the next sacrifice. That's when I understood what Catherine's letters really were. They weren't just messages of hope. They were battle plans. She'd spent her final months learning everything she could about Garrett's operation, documenting evidence, preparing weapons for spiritual warfare, and she'd hidden it all throughout that house, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to find it. Her voice hardened. That night I stopped being a victim. I stopped praying for rescue and started praying for justice, because I finally understood that sometimes God's answer to evil isn't gentle deliverance, it's righteous wrath, and I was about to become his instrument. That night I became a different person, Marlena said, standing up and pacing despite her injuries. Fear was still there, but it was buried under something stronger. Rage, not just at Garrett, but at myself for being passive for so long while evil flourished around me. She stopped pacing and faced me directly. Catherine had left me a roadmap. Her letters contained names, dates, locations. She documented everything about Garrett's network, who was involved, where they met, how they selected their victims. It was like she'd spent her final months building a case that would take decades to unravel. I started photographing everything with an old camera I found in the attic. Every document, every piece of evidence, every symbol in that basement. If something happened to me, at least there would be proof left behind. But more than that, I started following Garrett, learning his patterns, his associates, his weaknesses. The cross Pastor Benjamin had given me seemed to make me invisible when I needed to be. I could slip out of the house, track him to his meetings, document everything without being seen. Her eyes gleamed with remembered determination. They met in more places than just our basement. There was an abandoned church on the outskirts of town, St. Mary's, closed down in 1982 after the congregation couldn't afford repairs. Garrett's group had been using it for their bigger rituals, the ones that required more ... space. I broke in one night when I knew they wouldn't be there. What I found ... double quotes, she shuddered. They'd turned the sanctuary into a mockery of everything holy. The altar was covered in stains I didn't want to identify, crosses hung upside down, religious statues defiled in ways that made me physically sick, but I also found their records. Meeting minutes, if you can believe it. They kept detailed logs of their activities like some twisted business operation. Names of people they'd targeted, methods they'd used, money they'd made from insurance payouts and inherited property. She pulled out a small notebook from her jacket pocket. I copied everything. 23 years of murder, theft, and spiritual corruption, all documented in their own handwriting. Why did you just go to the police? Marlena laughed bitterly. Because I found police names in those records. Sheriff Morrison, Catherine's own brother, had been paid to look the other way when she disappeared. Deputy Collins was actually a member of the group. Judge Hartwell had been taking bribes to dismiss cases that got too close to the truth. The corruption went all the way to the top. These men hadn't just been killing individuals, they'd been systematically destroying anyone who threatened their operation for over 2 decades. So what did you do? I started sending anonymous letters to newspapers in neighboring towns, copied sections of evidence and mailed them to FBI field offices 3 states away, created a paper trail that couldn't be buried or bought off. But more importantly, I started preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. Because Catherine's final letter had made one thing clear: this wasn't going to end with exposure or arrests. Too many people in power were involved. Too much evil had taken root. The only way to stop it was to destroy it at its source. And the source was Garrett himself. She touched the cross outline at her neck again. Catherine had discovered something about the spiritual mechanics of what they were doing. These weren't just murders, they were ritual sacrifices that gave the group actual supernatural power, real protection from consequences, real influence over others. But that power had a weakness. It was tied to specific objects, specific locations, specific ... vessels. Destroy the right things in the right way, and the entire network would collapse. She'd figured out how to break their power permanently, but she'd died before she could act on the knowledge. Her voice grew steady and determined. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. I was going to finish what she started, no matter what it cost me, even if it meant confronting Garrett directly, even if it meant going into that basement one final time. Garrett found my camera 3 days later, Marlena said, her voice trembling with the memory. I'd gotten careless, too confident in my invisibility, left it under the mattress instead of returning it to its hiding place in the attic. She sat back down heavily, as if the weight of what came next was too much to bear standing. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard him roaring my name from upstairs. Not calling, roaring, like an animal that had been wounded. I knew immediately what he'd found. The camera, the photographs, probably some of Catherine's letters I'd been studying. My blood turned to ice, but part of me was almost ... relieved. The pretending was over. He came down those stairs like a man possessed. Literally. His face was twisted into something inhuman. His eyes were completely black, and when he spoke, his voice had that same otherworldly quality I'd heard during the basement ritual. "You stupid bitch," he snarled, and I could smell sulfur on his breath. "Did you really think you could spy on us? Did you think we wouldn't know?" She pressed her burned palms against her temples. He grabbed me by the hair and dragged me to the basement door. But this time was different. This time, he wanted me to see everything. The basement was lit up like Christmas, dozens of black candles burning, symbols carved fresh into the walls, and his 5 brothers standing around that defiled altar wearing their ritual robes. Quote, "They'd been waiting for me." "Meet my wife," Garrett announced, throwing me down the wooden steps. The one who thought she could document our work and live to tell about it. I landed hard at the bottom, and that's when I saw them clearly for the first time. Men I recognized from around town: the bank president, the police chief, the mayor's son, Dr. Peterson from the medical center, and Father Mackenzie from St. Augustine's Catholic Church. Her voice broke. A priest, a man sworn to serve God, standing there in black robes covered with symbols that blasphemed everything sacred. They formed a circle around me while Garrett descended the steps slowly, savoring my terror. "Did you know," he said conversationally, "that your precious Catherine tried the same thing? Thought she could expose us, destroy what we'd built?" He walked to a corner of the basement I'd never noticed before and pulled back a tarp. Underneath was a glass display case, and inside ... double quotes. She couldn't continue for a moment. Inside was Catherine's skeleton, still wearing her wedding dress, still wearing the silver cross around her neck. The one Pastor Benjamin had given me was a replica. "She's been our guest of honor for 8 years, Garrett said, stroking the glass lovingly, watching every ritual, blessing every sacrifice. "Even in death, she serves our cause." That's when he revealed the truth about my marriage, about why I'd been chosen. Did you think it was love? He laughed. Did you think it was coincidence that I found you right when your family lost everything? He pulled out a folder thick with documents. I've been watching you since you were 16, waiting for the right moment to strike. Your faith, your innocence, your desperation, they made you perfect for what we needed, you see. Every few years, our power requires ... renewal, a sacrifice of particular purity. Catherine lasted us 8 years. You should have lasted us 10. He gestured to his companions. But since you've chosen to be difficult, we'll have to accelerate the timeline. Tonight, instead of next year during the harvest moon. That's when I understood. I wasn't just the next victim, I was the next source of power for their entire operation. My death wouldn't just kill me, it would fuel their evil for another decade. She looked at me with eyes full of remembered terror and determination, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with the same frightened girl who'd let Garrett burn her Bible months earlier. They had no idea what Catherine's preparations and pastor Benjamin's blessing had turned me into. While they prepared their ritual, I made a discovery that changed everything, Marlena whispered, her voice barely audible. Garrett left me chained to a pipe in the corner while he and his brothers arranged their instruments of sacrifice. They thought I was helpless, broken, ready for slaughter. She touched her wrists where faint scars from shackles were still visible. But the pipe I was chained to was hollow, and sound traveled through it from somewhere else in the house. I could hear voices, not just from the basement but from upstairs. Other voices, women's voices. I thought I was hallucinating at first. The terror, the blood loss from where the chains had cut me. I assumed my mind was breaking, but then I heard one voice clearly calling my name. Marlena, can you hear us? It was Catherine's voice, but impossible. She'd been dead for 8 years. Her hands trembled as she continued. Then other voices joined in. The 3 wives who'd come before me, the ones whose names were in Garrett's ledger. All of them speaking through that pipe. All of them trying to tell me something crucial. Look behind the altar, Catherine's voice urged. Look at what they've really been doing all these years. I twisted around as far as the chains would allow and saw something that made my blood freeze. The basement wall behind the altar wasn't solid stone like I'd thought. It was a thin veneer covering something else. A door. While Garrett and his companions chanted in their perverted language, I managed to work one hand free from the shackles. The cross Pastor Benjamin had given me was burning against my chest, so hot it was leaving marks. But somehow that pain gave me strength. I crawled to that hidden door and found a way to open it. What lay beyond ... She stopped, struggling to find words. It was a catacomb, not just a room. Tunnels extending deep under the town, lined with shelves carved into the rock. And on those shelves were hundreds of bodies. Men, women, children, all mummified by the strange, cold air down there. But these weren't just random victims. Each body wore a cross, clutched a Bible, or had some other symbol of faith. They'd been specifically targeting Christians for decades, maybe centuries. The network wasn't just about power and money. It was about systematic elimination of God's people from the town. She looked directly at me, and at the far end of the main tunnel was something that explained everything. An ancient altar, older than the house, older than the town itself, carved with symbols that hurt to look at and covered in stains that were clearly blood. This place had been used for human sacrifice long before Garrett was born. The Native Americans who originally lived here had warned the first settlers about this spot, called it the place where earth bleeds. But instead of avoiding it, someone had built on it deliberately. The entire town had been constructed around this unholy site. Every accident and every disappearance, every bit of corruption and evil that had plagued the area for generations, it all traced back to feeding this ancient hunger. Garrett wasn't the leader of some modern devil-worshipping cult. He was just the latest in a line of caretakers stretching back over 200 years, each one responsible for keeping the sacrifices coming. And I realized why the voices of the dead wives could speak to me. They weren't really dead, not completely. Their souls were trapped here, bound to this place by the same dark power that gave Garrett and his group their abilities. Free us, Catherine's voice pleaded from everywhere and nowhere. Break the cycle. End what should have ended generations ago. That's when I understood what Pastor Benjamin had meant about God preparing me for war. This wasn't just about stopping Garrett. It was about destroying something that had been feeding on human suffering since before America was a nation. But as I crouched there among the bones of the faithful, I heard Garrett's voice calling from the basement. Time's up, wife. Your God has had his chance to save you, and he's chosen silence. Now it's our turn to speak. The file ritual was about to begin. They dragged me back to the basement and chained me to that defiled altar, Marlena said, her voice becoming distant and hollow. The 6 of them formed a circle around me, their black robes making them look like vultures waiting to feed. She pulled her jacket tighter, though the night had grown warm. Garrett stood at my head, holding a knife that looked ancient, the same blade that had killed Catherine. the same one that had spilled the blood of hundreds before me. The metal was stained black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Your precious God," he said, placing the cold blade against my throat, "has abandoned you just like he abandoned all the others. Where are his angels now? Where are his miracles?" The other 5 began chanting in that language that made my bones ache. The basement grew colder with each word, and the shadows on the walls started moving independently of the candlelight. I could feel something pressing down on the room, something vast and hungry and ancient. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time since Pastor Benjamin had given me the cross, I felt truly alone. The voices of the dead wives had gone silent. Even Catherine couldn't reach me anymore. "See?" Garrett laughed, pressing the knife harder against my skin. "Your faith was just delusion. There is no God coming to save you. There is only us, only this power, only the hunger that we serve." She closed her eyes, reliving the terror. He was right, in a way. I was going to die there in that basement, surrounded by evil, just like Catherine, just like all the others. Another faithful soul fed to whatever darkness lived beneath that town. The chanting reached a crescendo, and I felt the knife begin to cut. Not deep enough to kill immediately. They wanted me to suffer, to lose hope completely before the end. My blood began to drip onto the altar, and something in the basement responded. The shadows grew thicker, the air grew colder, and I could hear ... laughter. Not human laughter. That's when I finally understood what Pastor Benjamin had meant about God's victories looking like defeats at first. I wasn't supposed to escape this. I wasn't supposed to be rescued at the last moment like in some fairy tale. I was supposed to die. But as the knife cut deeper and my blood flowed more freely, something unexpected happened. The cross around my neck, the one that had been burning against my chest, suddenly flared with light so bright it blinded everyone in the room. The chanting stopped. The shadows recoiled. And through the brilliant light I heard Catherine's voice again, clearer than ever. "Now, Marlena, while his light is in you, while your blood is still pure." Now, I realized what she meant, what Pastor Benjamin had meant, what God had been preparing me for all along. The sacrifice wasn't supposed to be stopped. It was supposed to be ... redirected. With the last of my strength, I grabbed Garrett's wrist and forced the knife deeper into my own throat. But as I did, I spoke the words Catherine had taught me through those whispered conversations by the pipe. "I give my life willingly to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let my blood break every chain, shatter every altar, and cast down every throne raised against heaven." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The light from the cross exploded outward like a bomb, and the ancient altar beneath me cracked down the middle. The basement walls began to shake, and somewhere deep below, something that had been sleeping for centuries screamed in agony. That's when I learned that sometimes God's greatest victories require the ultimate sacrifice. "But the story doesn't end with my death," she said quietly, opening her eyes to look at me. "Because what happened next defied every law of nature and theology. I thought I understood. I should have died on that altar," Marlena said, her voice filled with wonder despite everything she'd endured. The knife had cut deep enough to sever major arteries. I could feel my life pouring out onto that cursed stone, could feel my heart slowing, my vision darkening. She touched her throat where a thin scar was barely visible. But as my blood mixed with the blood of all those who had died before me, something extraordinary happened. The ancient altar didn't just crack, it began to dissolve, like acid eating through stone. My freely given sacrifice was destroying the very foundation of their power. Garrett and his companions were screaming now, not in triumph, but in terror. The light from Catherine's cross had become unbearable, filling every corner of the basement and driving back shadows that had lived there for generations. Through the brilliant radiance, I saw them clearly for what they truly were. Not just evil men, but vessels for something far older and darker. And as the altar crumbled beneath me, whatever had been possessing them began to flee. Father Mackenzie was the first to collapse, his body convulsing as something dark and writhing poured out of his mouth like smoke. Dr. Peterson followed, then the bank president, then the others. One by one they fell to the basement floor, their black robes smoldering in the holy light. But Garrett fought it. He'd been the primary vessel for so long, had given so much of himself to the darkness, that it wouldn't release him easily. He staggered backwards, still holding the knife, his face twisting between human and something else entirely. "This isn't possible," he screamed, but his voice was changing, becoming multiple voices layered on top of each other. "We are eternal. We have fed on this place for centuries. You cannot." That's when Catherine appeared. Marlena's eyes filled with tears, not as a voice through the pipes, but physically present in the basement. Translucent but real, wearing her wedding dress but no longer bound to her skeleton in the corner. The cross around her neck blazed with the same light as mine. "Garrett Morrison," she said, and her voice carried the authority of every soul he'd ever murdered. "By the power of the one who conquers death, By the blood willingly shed for love of the innocent, your reign ends tonight. Behind her came others, the 3 wives who'd died before me. Dozens of faithful souls from the catacombs, all of them shining with that same impossible light. They formed a circle around Garrett, who was now writhing on the floor as the thing possessing him fought to maintain control. But the darkness was losing. With each drop of my blood that hit the disintegrating altar, its power weakened. The ancient evil that had fed on human sacrifice for generations was being starved by a sacrifice freely given in love rather than taken in hatred. That's when I understood the true miracle. I wasn't dying, I was being transformed. My willing sacrifice had broken the spiritual laws that bound this place, and in breaking them I'd become something new, something that could stand between the living and the dead, between light and darkness. The knife wound in my throat began to heal, but not naturally. Divine light sealed the cut, leaving only a thin scar as a reminder of what had transpired. I sat up on the crumbling altar, no longer chained, no longer helpless. Around me the basement was transforming. The carved symbols were burning away, the black candles were melting into nothing, and the walls themselves were becoming clean stone again. But the real change was in Garrett. The thing that had possessed him for decades was finally being driven out, and what remained was just a man. A broken, terrified man who suddenly remembered every life he'd taken, every soul he'd destroyed. He looked at me with human eyes for the first time in years and whispered, "Marlena ... What have I done? What have we all done?" What happened next was the most terrifying part of the entire ordeal, Marlena said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Because for one brief moment I saw Garrett as he truly was underneath all that darkness. Not a monster, just a man who had made a choice decades ago and had been paying the price ever since. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warm night air. The thing that had possessed him was gone, driven out by the light, but it hadn't left quietly. As it fled, it showed me everything. Every murder, every ritual, every innocent life taken, but from Garrett's perspective. He'd been 18 when they first approached him. His father had been the previous caretaker of that cursed place, and when the old man died, the responsibility fell to him. But he tried to refuse, had even gone to church, tried to find another way. That's when they brought him his first victim, a young woman about my age. Told him if he didn't perform the sacrifice, they'd kill her anyway and then come for his mother and sister. He thought he was saving his family by damning himself, but each sacrifice made the next one easier. Each ritual gave him more power, more protection, more reasons to believe he was doing what was necessary, until eventually the darkness didn't have to force him anymore. He wanted it. She looked at me with haunted eyes. Do you understand what that means? For just a moment I felt compassion for the man who had tortured me for months. Because I saw how evil really works, not by creating monsters, but by convincing good people to make small compromises until they're too far gone to turn back. But that moment of human connection didn't last long, because as the ancient evil fled from Garrett, it didn't just disappear. It went looking for a new host. The other 5 men were unconscious on the basement floor, their minds shattered by what they'd experienced. But upstairs I could hear footsteps, heavy boots on wooden floors. The sound of windows being forced open, doors being kicked in. Garrett looked at me with clear, terrified eyes. "They're coming," he whispered. "The others, the ones who weren't here tonight, they know what happened, and they're coming to stop it." I realized the network was larger than just the 6 men in the basement. There were others throughout the town, others who had been drawing power from this place, who had too much to lose if it was destroyed completely. "How many?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Dozens," he said, struggling to his feet. "Police, judges, business owners, even some from neighboring towns. This place has been feeding them for generations." Without it ... single quotes he didn't finish, but I understood. Without the ancient evil to protect them, all their crimes would come to light. All their victims would demand justice. All their carefully constructed lives would crumble. They weren't coming to perform another ritual. They were coming to kill me before I could complete whatever I'd started. That's when Catherine spoke again, her translucent form flickering like candlelight. "The altar is broken, but the source runs deeper. To end this permanently, you have to go below, to the original site, and you have to ... single quotes." She paused, her expression filled with sorrow. "What?" I demanded. "I have to what?" "You have to choose," she said quietly, "your life or theirs. Your freedom or their destruction. The light you carry now can cleanse this place completely, but only if you're willing to take it to the source and never come back." I heard the footsteps getting closer, heard voices shouting orders in the house above. Garrett grabbed my arm with surprising gentleness. "There's another way down," he said, "through the catacombs. I can show you." "But Marlena ... single quotes," his voice broke. "I'm so sorry. For everything. I know it doesn't matter now, but I'm sorry." I looked at this man who had been my tormentor, who had burned my Bible and broken my body, and I made a choice that surprised us both. "You can earn forgiveness," I told him. "Help me finish this. Help me end what your father started, what you continued." Die clean instead of dirty. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. And together we headed deeper into the darkness to face the source of centuries of evil. What I found at the source changed everything. I thought I knew about good, evil, and the price of justice, Marlena said, her voice carrying a strange mixture of peace and terrible knowledge. She stood up from the bus stop bench, and for the first time I noticed she moved differently than before. Not like someone who had been broken, but like someone who carried an enormous weight with perfect balance. Garrett led me through the catacombs to a chamber that existed before the town. Before the first settlers, maybe before recorded history. The walls were covered in symbols that predated any known language, and in the center was a well that descended so far down I couldn't see the bottom. That's where it lived. Not the evil that had possessed Garrett and his accomplices. That was just an extension. A tendril reaching up from something far older and more terrible. The real source of the darkness was down in that well, waiting. Catherine appeared beside us one final time. "This is where it ends," she said. "Where it always had to end. Someone with pure faith and willing sacrifice has to take the light down there and seal it forever." I understood then why I'd survived the altar, why I'd been transformed instead of simply killed. God hadn't rescued me from the sacrifice, he'd prepared me to make the ultimate one. But as I approached the well, Garrett did something I never expected. He stepped in front of me. "No," he said quietly. "I've lived with this darkness for 23 years. I've fed it, served it, let it corrupt everything I touched. This is my responsibility to finish." He looked at me with those clear, human eyes. "The light you carry, it's not meant to be buried down there. It's meant to survive, to go back into the world and prevent others from making the choices I made." Her voice grew softer. That's when I realized the final truth. Redemption isn't just about forgiveness, it's about transformation. Garrett wasn't the same man who had burned my Bible months earlier. The light had changed him, shown him what he really was beneath all the darkness. He took the cross from around my neck, Catherine's cross that had been burning with holy fire. As soon as it touched his skin, it flared so brightly we were both temporarily blinded. "Tell them," he said, stepping to the edge of the well. "Tell them what really happened here. Tell them that evil can be defeated, but only by those willing to pay the price." Then he jumped. Marlena's burned hands trembled as she continued. The light from the cross followed him down into that impossible depth. I watched it fall like a star, getting smaller and smaller until it was just a point of brilliance in absolute darkness. Then came the explosion. Not of fire or force, but of pure spiritual energy that shot up from the well like a geyser. The entire chamber shook, the catacombs began to collapse, and I ran through falling stone and crumbling passages while behind me, something that had existed since the dawn of time screamed as it died. I made it to the surface just as the house collapsed into itself. The basement, the altar, the catacombs, everything fell into the void left by that cleansed well. And with it went the source of power that had corrupted the town for generations. She turned to face me directly. But here's what the newspapers didn't report. What the official investigation never uncovered. Garrett didn't die when he jumped into that well. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "When they found him 3 days later in the ruins, the coroner said he died from the collapse. But I knew better. The burns on his hands, the expression on his face, he'd lived long enough to complete the sealing. Long enough to hold that cross against whatever was down there until the light consumed it completely. He died. Clean. Redeemed. The man who had served darkness for decades had chosen to destroy it with his final act." She showed me her own burned palms again. "These marks? They appeared the moment he made that choice. Not from touching something evil, but from holding something so holy it left permanent traces. I carry the proof of his redemption. And the others? The network of corruption? Within a week, they all confessed. Every crime, every cover-up, every innocent life they'd taken. The compulsion to truth that followed the well's cleansing was irresistible. The town is clean now, for the first time in centuries." Marlena gathered her small purse and prepared to leave. But that's not the end of the story, because I learned something about sacrifice that night. Sometimes God doesn't want us to die for him, he wants us to live for him, to carry the light into other dark places, to stand against evil wherever we find it. I'm not the same woman who married Garrett 3 years ago. I'm not even entirely human anymore. I'm something new, a guardian, a witness, a living reminder that no darkness is too deep for God's light to reach. She smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, it reached her eyes. So when people ask me what happened to my husband, I tell them the truth. He humiliated me, burned my Bible, and thought he could mock God without consequences. But he never expected what God would do in return. He never expected that divine justice would come wrapped in mercy, that his own victim would become the instrument of his redemption. As she walked away into the dawn light, I realized I'd witnessed something that would change how I understood faith, sacrifice, and the terrible, wonderful ways that God answers prayer. Marlena disappeared around the corner, but her words echoed in my mind. Sometimes the greatest victories look like defeats at first. Sometimes God's answers come in ways we never expect. The bus stop where she'd sat was empty now, but somehow it felt blessed.